Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Pfeffernüsse. That's right, the name of this German spice cookie translates to pepper nuts, which is kind of funny since the original recipes do not call for pepper or nuts. But misleading names aside, I think this is the best Christmas cookie of all time, which I realize is a bold statement. So what I'll do is show you how to make these cookies now, and then you do a batch or two and see if you agree, which I'm pretty sure you will. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with one of the easiest cookie doughs you'll ever make, which we'll start by adding some white sugar to a saucepan, along with some brown sugar, as well as a little bit of honey. And by the way, some recipes call for molasses, but I prefer it without, because molasses has such a distinct, strong flavor that it could sort of dominate the taste of the cookie. Plus, I think it makes it taste a little too close to gingerbread. But anyway, after the honey, we'll add a little splash of water, at which point I like to add my spices, which for me will include cinnamon, some ground ginger, cardamom, as well as some freshly and finely grated nutmeg. We will also want a little bit of ground allspice and a little touch of ground clove. And then last but not least, a little bit of cayenne pepper. Although in most recipes the pepper included is white pepper, or maybe black pepper. But you know me, I'm more of a cayenne guy. And then once everything's in there, we can head to the stove and place this over medium heat, where we will cook it stirring until it just starts to simmer and our sugars have dissolved, which is only going to take a minute or two. So please don't go anywhere. Okay, we don't want this to start boiling and reducing. Okay, all we're doing is dissolving the sugar and waking up those spices. Okay, so as soon as that happens and our mixture looks a little something like this, we'll go ahead and remove that from the heat, and we will let it sit and cool for about 4 or 5 minutes before we add the rest of our ingredients. And those will include some salt, some baking soda, a splash of heavy cream, or milk if you want. But this cookie dough doesn't include any butter, so I don't mind that little extra touch of richness. And then we'll also add 1 beaten egg, which is why we wanted to let this cool down a little bit. And that's it. We'll take a whisk and we'll give this a thorough mixing until we have everything nicely incorporated. And once that happens, we will lose the whisk and we will add the last ingredient, which is some all-purpose flour. And we will stir all that together with a wooden spoon until everything comes together to form our cookie dough. Oh, and while I'm doing this, let me explain the mystery of the name. Okay, the nut part comes from the fact that these are small like nuts. And as far as the pepper part, way back in the day, pepper was a generic name for any kind of spice. So the cinnamon, the ground ginger, the allspice, etc. would have all been referred to as pepper. And apparently over the years, people started to take the name literally, and they'd add a little bit of white pepper to sort of bring up the heat and amplify the ginger. And like I said, most people use white pepper, but I think the cayenne works beautifully. But anyway, like I said, we will stir this until a cookie dough forms, which is going to look and feel like this. And once that's happened, what we'll do is transfer this onto a piece of plastic wrap, and we will gather and press that together and then wrap it very tightly, at which point we really do want to let this rest in the fridge. All right, of course you can use it right away, but for best results, I think we want to let this rest in the fridge for a day or even 2, which in case you're keeping score at home is how long I let mine refrigerate. And that's it. After a day or 2 of chillaxing in the fridge, we'll go ahead and pull out our dough and unwrap it. And don't be surprised if that color's darkened a little bit. That is completely normal and not a problem. And then what we'll do is portion this dough onto a parchment-lined baking sheet. And for that, I like to use this little sorbet scoop so that all my pepper nuts are the same size. I mean, do you want irregular pepper nuts? I didn't think so. And because these are supposed to be nice and small and nut-sized, we only want to do about a rounded teaspoon of dough, which by the way is exactly what fits in this scoop. But if you don't have one, you can just use a teaspoon. Or of course, weigh portions on a digital scale, since really the ultimate goal is to get these all exactly the same size or as close as we possibly can. And as you can see at this size, I'm going to be able to get 24 on this sheet pan. And then what we'll do once those are portioned is give those a quick roll between our palms to make them nice and smooth, which by the way is optional. All right, they'll probably cook up just fine if you don't do this. But personally, I want these as round with as smooth of a top as possible, especially if we're going to give these as an edible holiday gift. But anyway, you decide. I mean, you are after all the Medusa of your Pfeffernüsse. And speaking of turning things into stone, once those are rolled, we are going to bake these, but only for a very short period of time. since we do not under any circumstances want these to get hard and crunchy. So what we'll do once these are set is transfer those into a 375-degree oven for only 9 or 10 minutes, or until they look like this. Okay, if everything's gone according to plan, these should have cooked up to a perfect dome shape, and the bottoms will have turned a very light golden brown. And that's it. We'll simply let those cool on the pan, all the way down to room temperature before we try to ice them. Okay, icing hot cookies is never a good idea, and you're going to have a big sweet mess. So be patient and let these cool all the way down. And that's it. Once these are fully cooled, I'm going to go ahead and finish these by using the old dip, drip, and flip, which involves dipping these in a nice thick powdered sugar icing, which is nothing more than powdered sugar with some lemon juice stirred in. And after we dip, we let it drip, and then we finish with a flip. And as you can see, we'll place those on a rack so that any excess can drip off. And I should mention, a lot of people just dust these with powdered sugar, but I much prefer this method, since what's going to happen after we dip, drip, and flip is that icing's going to dry, and it's going to lose its shiny appearance, but it's going to eventually end up nice and crisp, which I think is a beautiful textural contrast to that somewhat soft, slightly chewy cookie. And yes, we probably should have put a piece of newspaper under that rack to catch those drips. And you're probably thinking, newspaper? Where do you get that, at the museum? Well, that's a good point, but paper towel or a little piece of parchment paper would also work. But anyway, as soon as that coating is dry, we are ready to enjoy, as I said, what I think is the best Christmas cookie of all time. Just a tremendous amount of spicy holiday flavor in a tiny little adorable package, elevated, as I said, by that thin, crispy, slightly lemony icing. Oh, and let me freeze this shot right here so I can show you that in some of the cookies you're going to have a little bit of a cavity, which is not a problem. That means these didn't collapse when they cooled, which means a cookie with a very smooth, perfect dome-shaped top. So I just wanted to show you that's a feature, not a bug. Oh, and speaking of the tops, I think these look amazing, but if you did want something a little more festive, feel free to shake over some sprinkles while the icing is still wet, which is what I did here with a beautiful wintry palette of ice blue and mossy green, which I think does look pretty nice. But to be honest, I really do prefer the unadorned top, which I think is gorgeous as is. And of course, if we are going to bring these to a party or give them as a gift, you cannot go wrong transferring those into a Santa from the waist down cookie tin. Although there is one huge problem here. Apparently this Santa was a belt and suspenders kind of guy, which is one of my many pet peeves. I mean, come on, belt and suspenders people. Pick one and go with it. You do not need both. But that aside, this did make for a very nice presentation. And while there are so many different spiced holiday cookies, the reason I like these so much is they're not just one note. Right? They have all those beautiful warming winter spices, but there is so much going on besides that, which I can't really explain, but really I don't need to. Like I said, you'll understand once you try these. And above and beyond the flavor, as I already touched on, the contrast between that soft, slightly chewy cookie and that thin, crisp icing coating is just absolute cookie perfection. Oh, and one last quick tip here. If you overfill the tin and the lid won't fit, just simply keep eating the cookies off the top until it will. And now if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go share these with some very lucky neighbors. I hope they're home. And I also hope you give these amazing German Christmas cookies a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Chocolate chip cookies. That's right, this amazing recipe is by far the most closely guarded secret in the history of food wishes. Well, actually, that's not true. The fact that my mustache is fake is probably really the biggest secret. But food-wise, it's definitely these chocolate chip cookies. And not only does this produce literally the perfect chocolate chip cookie, it's also the easiest procedure I've ever seen and requires no electric mixer. So let's go ahead and get started with the dry ingredients. And for that, we're going to need some all-purpose flour. Yep, no matter what your purpose, this kind of flour will work. And then to that, we're going to add a spoon of baking soda, not baking powder. Repeat, not baking powder, baking soda. In fact, I shouldn't even mention baking powder because now you're thinking about it. And then last but not least, of course, we're going to need some salt. And then what we'll do is we'll grab a whisk and give this a mix for about a minute so that everything gets incorporated evenly. And this is more of a contemporary technique. Back in the day, we would have had you put this through your sifter, but you don't have a sifter, but you do have a whisk. So like I said, we'll mix that up for about a minute. at which point we'll simply set that aside and move on to the rest of the dough. And that's going to begin with a little bit of butter, just a cup. And why is it so yellow? Because they let the cows eat grass like they're supposed to. But anyway, we're going to need a cup of butter and some very soft butter at that. And it's this nice soft butter along with a heavy-duty spatula that makes this procedure so simple and electric mixer free. So what we'll do is we'll add some white sugar and some brown sugar. And once we add our sugar, we will take the back of our heavy-duty spatula and begin to do what they call cream the butter and the sugar. So we'll simply use the back of our spatula to smear and smush and smash that all together. And things might start off a little slow, but just keep at it. And after a few short minutes of thoughtful spatulation, you should be looking at something that's very light in texture, almost borderline fluffy. And even though we're not going to use an electric mixer, this really isn't going to take very long. I mean, this really should only take you a couple minutes, and I'm including time to daydream in that, okay? But anyway, like I said, we're going to cream all that together for a couple minutes until we end up with something that looks like this, at which point we can proceed with the rest of the ingredients. So let's go ahead and add some vanilla extract. Of course, we're going to use the real and the pure. And then after the vanilla, we'll do a couple tablespoons of milk. And in the spirit of full disclosure, I'm not even using real milk. I'm using almond milk. Oh yeah, Chef John's a little more of a hippie than one would suspect. So we'll do a little bit of milk, and then we'll also need one large egg, and then we'll grab a whisk and mix this all together. And please take note how when I start off here, I'm sort of keeping my whisk on one side, sort of mixing one spot very thoroughly before moving on to another spot. And the reason I do that is because there's a very small chance, very small, but a chance nonetheless, that if we try to mix this all together too fast, it can separate and not come together into the creamy mass we're looking for. So by starting and staying in one spot until it kind of starts coming together, you pretty much eliminate any chance that's going to happen. So we'll go ahead and we'll give that a very thorough mixing with the whisk until that vanilla, egg, and milk are perfectly incorporated. And once that's happened, let's go ahead and switch to the spatula, and we'll use that to clean up and scrape down our sides so we can move on to the final steps, which are as follows. Let's go ahead and grab our flour mixture and dump it right in, and then we'll take our spatula and mix that in, which should only take a minute if that. And do not worry about overmixing the dough. This recipe requires exactly zero finesse. Really, the hardest part about this step is not having the flour fly out of the bowl. And then as soon as that flour has been successfully incorporated, we will add the last and maybe most important ingredient, the chocolate chips. And of course, semi-sweet is your classic choice. But really, any kind of chocolate's going to work here. Except white chocolate. I don't like white chocolate. So we'll mix those in. And then as soon as our chocolate chips are incorporated, our dough is officially done. And yes, it can be used immediately, but for best results, I recommend transferring this into some kind of zip-top plastic bag and chilling it before we try to scoop it. Not only do I think the texture of the final baked cookie is a little better, for reasons that I can't scientifically explain, but cold, firm cookie dough is way, way easier to work with than soft, sticky, room temperature dough. So I did refrigerate my dough for a couple hours, at which point we'll pull it out, and as suspected, it was colder and firmer. And at this point, we are ready to scoop and bake cookies. And for me, the easiest way to do that is with one of these little sorbet scoops. All right, this one holds just about a rounded tablespoon, which I find is the perfect amount. And because we chilled our dough in a bag, it's very easy to stick this scoop in there, grab the perfect amount of dough, and then use the bag to even it off so we don't have to get our fingers all dirty. I mean, what's worse than licking cookie dough off your fingers? So that's my method. Although instead of scooping them onto a table, what we really want to do is scoop these onto a parchment paper lined baking sheet. And please do not crowd them. I don't really think you should put more than 8 per pan. So I'm going to use the old classic 2-1-2-1-2 placement system. Then once we've scooped and evenly spaced our dough, we will transfer that pan into the center of a 375-degree oven for about 12 minutes, or until our cookies get beautifully golden brown around the edges and look like this. Check it out. Those look good. And if everything's gone according to plan, the outside of our cookies should be beautifully crisp. But even though the outsides are crispy, the cookie itself remains flexible, moist, and beautifully chewy. So what I like to do is just slide them off using the paper onto a cooling rack, just like that. And those will firm up enough to handle in just a few minutes, at which point we can lose the paper, and ideally let these cool completely. I know, some of you like warm chocolate chip cookies. That is your right. You are the Snooki of your cookie. But I think to fully appreciate the texture and taste, you should let these cool all the way down to room temp. And by the way, to kill time while I waited for mine to cool, I decided to hold one up to the light so we could see just how thin these are, and also kind of see that inner bubbly matrix that gives these cookies their incredible texture. But anyway, I did let mine cool, at which point it was time to taste what I consider the perfect chocolate chip, which for me means the perfect balance between crispy and chewy, which is exactly what I think we have here. But don't take it from me. Listen for yourself. And despite the outer edges being crispy, the rest of the cookie is still flexible, chewy, moist, and unbelievably delicious. So anyway, that's it, the official Food Wishes chocolate chip cookie. My sincerest apologies for making you wait 8 years for this. Hey, I've been busy, but I am glad we finally posted it, and I really, really do hope you give this a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Gingersnap Cookies. That's right, appearances to the contrary, I'm not a big cookie guy. I don't really eat a lot of cookies, nor do I bake a lot of cookies. But with the holidays rapidly approaching, I thought I'd show you a cookie recipe I do like making and eating, which would be this incredibly easy and beautiful ginger snap. And not only are you going to be able to do this recipe with no electric mixer, this formula is going to work whether you like your ginger snaps crispy or chewy. So let's go ahead and get started with the star of the show, ginger. So what I have here is some candied ginger, also known as crystallized ginger, and we're going to be using some of this in addition to the traditional dried ginger powder. So while technically optional, I really think this makes this recipe very, very special. And what we're going to want to do is chop this up very finely before we add it to our dough. And a great tip for this is to wipe your blade with a little bit of oil before you start chopping. And this goes for chopping any kind of dried fruit. If you rub your knife with a little bit of oil, it won't get all gummed up as you chop. So we're going to go ahead and chop that up pretty fine, as you can see. And that's going to give these cookies a whole other level of ginger goodness, both flavor-wise and texturally. So we'll go ahead and mince up our ginger, and we'll simply set that aside and move on to the dry ingredients, which is going to start with some all-purpose flour, to which we will add some baking soda. And you might be wondering, will baking powder work? No, it won't. You want baking soda. We also want a pinch of salt, as well as, of course, a generous amount of ground ginger, and an equally generous amount of cinnamon. We're also going to do a little touch of ground clove, and then a couple optional ingredients. Because I do like my ginger snap spicy, I'm going to toss in a pinch of freshly ground black pepper, and yes, we're going to add some cayenne. Just a little pinch, or a giant pinch, and then we'll go ahead and grab a whisk and give this a mixing, as usual, to make sure all those dry ingredients are thoroughly combined. And we will set that aside and move on to the wet ingredients. And by wet, I mean mostly buttery. So we're going to start with a stick and a half of unsalted room temperature butter. And I know room temp can vary greatly, so what we're looking for is butter that's not too firm and cold. All right, we don't want it melting, but we do want it smearable. Because what we're going to do is we're going to dump in some white sugar, and using the back of our spatula, we're going to cream all that together. And in virtually every cookie recipe known to man, they have you doing this with an electric mixer, which does work great if you have one and really feel like cleaning it. But I don't. So I'm just going to use my spatula, and after a couple minutes of smearing and stirring, you should end up with something that looks like this. And then once our butter and sugar have been successfully creamed together, we will go ahead and add in our minced up candied ginger, as well as some molasses, which is impossible to add quickly. So I always have to basically talk about nothing for a few seconds while it finishes dripping in. Then we're also going to want to do just a little touch of vanilla extract, of course pure and real, as well as one large beaten egg. And then what we need to do is go ahead and emulsify this all together before we add our dry ingredients. And even though I'm very experienced with this, and I do know better, I tried to accomplish this with the spatula because it was already dirty and in the bowl. So I began to spatulate this under the delusion that if I stirred long enough and hard enough, everything would come together and emulsify beautifully. Except right about here I realized that's not going to happen. And I thought to myself, what the heck are you doing? Switch to a whisk and do this right. And having the right tool makes all the difference. Because after just a few seconds of vigorous whisking, this came together perfectly. And yes, I will admit if you use an electric mixer, this does work faster and easier. But assuming you're smart enough to use the whisk, like I eventually did, this will come out exactly the same as if you'd used a mixer. Okay? And then once our wet ingredients are set, the last step is to add our dry ingredients to that bowl and simply mix this with a spatula until the flour just disappears. And while this is not difficult, you want to start out slow. Otherwise, you might have flour flying out of the bowl. And this really is not that temperamental of a dough. So don't worry too much about overmixing. But as I've said many times before, why would you want to mix if you don't have to? So all we're going to do here is mix that with the spatula until the flour disappears and your mixture looks like this. At which point we're going to stop and not make cookies. Because what we need to do before we form our cookies is wrap this up and chill it in the fridge for about an hour or until it's firm. So that's what you see me doing here. I'm going to wrap it up. I'm going to pop it in the fridge for about an hour. And as you'll see, that dough will have firmed up very nicely. So once our dough is chilled, we're going to go ahead and portion it up. And for that, I like to use this little sorbet scoop, which gives me exactly 1.5 teaspoons. And of course, you could just use a teaspoon to do this. But by using the scoop, you are going to get more uniform sizes. And then once we've scooped our dough, what we want to do is toss it into some sugar and roll it into a nice smooth ball before placing it on a parchment paper-lined baking sheet. But wait, there's more. We're going to take something flat, I just use a ramekin, and we're going to flatten that out. And once that's been accomplished, we'll sprinkle that with a little more sugar, and that's it. So we'll continue on scooping our dough, tossing it in sugar, and rolling it into a nice smooth ball. And then, like I said, we'll place it down on parchment paper, although a Silpat will work here. And by the way, if you use the classic 3-2-3-2-3 positioning system, you'll get what became known as the baker's dozen, which is going to give me 13 perfectly spaced cookies. And once that dough's been panned up, we are ready to head over to the oven, where we are going to bake these at 350 degrees for between 10 and 15 minutes, depending on how crispy you want them. So this pan here I cooked for the full 15 minutes, after which they're going to look like this, beautifully, beautifully browned. And since this batch is the crispy batch, we can let those cool right on the pan. And don't worry if a couple are touching. Once these cool down a little bit, you can just snap them apart. And if you do cook them about 14 to 15 minutes, you're going to end up with the classic crispy ginger snap. Or, as I did with this half dozen, you could just cook them 10 or 11 minutes, and you're going to get something that comes out a little bit more on the chewy side. Which, by the way, if you want them to stay that way, you want to get them off that hot pan. So I'm going to slide those off. And as you can see, when you go to snap these, they don't snap. They just sort of bend apart. And while they still might be a little crispy around the edge, that center still should retain a little bit of chewiness. So I'm going to go into detail on the blog post about times and textures. But bottom line, you're going to have to decide. You guys are the Wookiees of your cookies. And speaking of Wookiee, let me go ahead and Chewbacca another one of these so I can brag a little bit more about the taste, which is incredible. These have what I consider the classic ginger snap flavor, which is predominantly ginger and cinnamon. But because we added that black pepper and cayenne, these have a gorgeous extra spicy finish that I think you're going to find incredibly, incredibly addictive. I mean, if you can somehow eat less than 8 or 9 of these, I'm going to be very impressed. They are just that good. And one thing I find kind of interesting, the stack on the left only cooked 10 or 11 minutes, and this stack on the right cooked for almost 15, and yet they look virtually identical. So really the only difference will be the texture. And which do I prefer? Probably the crispy one. I mean, these are, after all, called ginger snaps, not ginger silently bend-aparts. But either way, you're talking about an amazing cookie experience. So I really do hope you give these a try soon. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.
Classic peanut butter cookies. And by classic, I mean no secret ingredients, no new modern techniques, just traditional old-fashioned cookie goodness. And here's how you make them. They're super easy. All right, into the bowl of our electric mixer, we're going to add some room temperature butter, some white sugar, some packed brown sugar, and of course, peanut butter. And I'm using the creamy style. You can use chunky if you want. And by the way, you don't want any fancy peanut butter here. I don't want to give the brand of the one I'm using, but it's really fast to find in the supermarket. In fact, you'll find it in a jiffy. I know that wasn't really a pun, but we haven't used that sound effect in a while, and I missed it. We're also going to add some salt, some baking powder, and baking soda. All right, so we're going to put on our paddle attachment, and we're going to cream the butter and the peanut butter together with the sugars. We're going to start slow so as not to have chunks of butter flying into our face. But once it starts to cream together, you can crank it up a little bit, and in about a minute, you should be looking at something like this. All right, so once that's all creamed together nicely, we're going to take a spatula and scrape down the sides. Now, if you want that job to be really annoying, use a tiny, freakishly small spatula like I have. It will take forever. So a little tip, choose a bigger spatula than I did. All right, once that's all scraped down, we're going to add 1 whole egg. Turn the mixer back on till that's mixed in. Same way, start slow and high. And that's only going to take about a minute to mix in. Oh, and by the way, one tip if you're making these in a kitchen where someone's making chocolate fudge cookies, be really careful you don't bump into them. Anyway, at that point, we're going to add the last ingredient, which is the flour. So I'm going to dump it all in. Again, we're going to start off on slow. And when it looks like that, it's not quite all mixed in. You can still see some flour. I'm going to stop it. I'm going to scrape down the sides, scrape down the paddle. All right, and then we're going to give this one last little quick mix. And we don't want to overmix, although that's not really a major issue with peanut butter cookie dough. All right, so once all that's cleaned up and scraped down, I'm going to put the paddle back in and just give it a couple more turns. All right, just like that. And that cookie dough is done. All right, so you're going to clean off your paddle, of course. You're going to scrape all the sides down, form that into a nice ball of dough, and then cover tightly with plastic wrap and refrigerate this for at least 2 to 3 hours. All right, the longer the better. You want this very, very cold before we shape our cookies. All right, so find something to do for about 3 hours. May I suggest a game of Monopoly? So enter Food Wish's time machine. It is now 3 hours later. So I'm going to take a half sheet pan. I'm going to cover it with my silicone baking mat. I'm also going to take one of these, sorbet scoop, which I think makes forming the cookies really simple. And not so much simple as it makes them all the same size. All right, now if you just want to go by eye and use a spoon and serve cookies that are different sizes, like some Savage, go ahead. But I think you should pick up one of these so your portions are nice and even. And once they're scooped, we're going to take that and with our palms, we're going to roll that into a very smooth ball. One tip, if you put a little bit of water on your hands and they're a little bit damp, you'll get a beautifully smooth surface. So once your cookies are scooped, rolled, and placed on your cookie sheet, the most fun part, the old Stampa Stampa. And to do the old Stampa Stampa, you're going to want to take a fork, press it down into the cookie dough about halfway down, turn it, and do the same thing 90 degrees that way. And that's how you get the signature peanut butter cookie cross-hatch mark. By the way, rumor has it that this cross-hatch peanut butter cookie design actually gave those nerds at Twitter the idea for the hashtag. I know, hashtag OMG. All right, once your cookies have all gotten the old Stampa Stampa, we're going to put those in a 375-degree oven for 10 minutes. And that's it. Look at that. Gorgeous, traditional peanut butter cookies. Now I want you to let those sit on the hot pan for just 5 minutes. And by that time, they'll be just cool enough to transfer to your rack, where they will sit until they're cool enough to eat. And what does that mean? Oh, that's up to you. I believe they're at their ultimate awesomeness, just slightly over room temperature, just a touch warm. But some people like them hot, some people like them cold. All right, so whatever turns you on, within reason. And that's it. What else can we say? A delicious, classic American cookie, soft, moist, rich in the middle, slightly crispy around the edges, just a perfect combination of textures, and that deep, not too sweet, very satisfying, nutty flavor, just a classic cookie lover's experience. So if you've never made homemade peanut butter cookies before, I hope you give these a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.
Thumbprint cookies. That's right, I am very excited to be sharing Grandma's amazing thumbprint cookie recipe. And for the record, not my grandma, a complete stranger's grandma, whose identity will be revealed in the blog post. But anyway, using her incredible and easy to make dough, we're actually going to do 2 versions of these cookies, only one of which require thumbs to make. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with this very simple dough. And we'll begin by adding some powdered sugar to some room temperature butter. And we'll take a spatula and cream this all together. And this dough is so simple and basic, we don't even need any electric mixers or any mechanical assistance of any kind. Okay, we're simply going to spatulate that butter and powdered sugar until it creams together, at which point we're going to stop and add a few more ingredients, including some vanilla extract, the pure and the real please, as well as a little touch of almond extract, which is technically optional, but I enjoy it. We will also toss in a pinch of salt, as well as 1 large egg yolk, which should not be confused here with a whole egg. Okay, we just want the yolk. And then we'll take our spatula and give that a mix. And right about here, the people that would insist on an electric mixer for this are going to say that by using just a spatula here, we're not going to be able to perfectly emulsify all those ingredients together, which is absolutely true. Or if you use a machine, this is going to look a lot smoother and creamier. and it won't have that kind of broken, grainy-ish appearance like this one does. But it does not matter, because when we stop and add the flour and continue to mix this, everything's going to get incorporated perfectly, and we're going to end up with the exact same final product as the people that pulled out the electric mixer. So go ahead and use the machinery if you want. I mean, in this production, you are the Helen Mirren of whether you're smearing. But to me, there's no advantage, and you're going to have more to clean up. So I'm going to blend this with nothing more than a spatula until all the flour is incorporated. And don't worry, you really can't overmix this dough. So if you mix it further once the flour is incorporated, it doesn't really cause a problem. But the point is, why would you keep on mixing once something's mixed? That's kind of crazy. So as soon as we have everything mixed together, we'll stop. And we will move on to form our cookies, which I like to portion out using this little sorbet scoop, because one rounded scoop is going to give me exactly a ½ ounce, also known as 1 tablespoon. And as we scoop these, what we'll do is transfer those onto a plate of white sugar and roll that around until it's covered, at which point we'll roll that between our palms to form a beautifully smooth ball, which we will then place on a Silpat line baking sheet. And in addition to making the outside of the cookie look better and have a better texture, that sugar is also going to prevent it from sticking to your palms as you roll this. And by the way, one of the secrets to perfect, uncracked thumbprint cookies is not refrigerating the dough. Okay, we really do want to work with that at room temperature so it's nice and soft. And then once we have those panned up, one more tip for avoiding cracks is before we make the well in the center of each one, we'll want to give those a little initial pressing with our fingers. All right, not too much. We'll just flatten those out a little bit before we move on to final fabrication. And there's basically 2 ways you can go here. One is a shortbread cookie featuring some jam, which is the one we're going to do first, and the other is a jam cookie featuring some shortbread. And for this first one, instead of using our thumb, I'm actually going to use the bottom of this freakishly large wooden spoon that I've lightly dusted with powdered sugar, and we'll press that straight down in, but not all the way to the bottom. Okay, we want to stop about 1/8 of an inch short. And by poking straight down with this spoon versus our thumb, we're going to get a smaller, sharper indentation that's going to give these more of what I call a bakery look. Oh, and by the way, if you don't have a thick spoon like this, you could just use one of your smaller non-thumb fingers. And then once all our dough balls have been handled, we'll go ahead and fill those with whatever jam we want. And right here I'm using one made from Marionberry, which I believe is the only berry named after a former U.S. mayor. So just a little bit of trivia for you. And then once we have those filled, I do like to give them the old tappa to kind of settle everything down. At which point these are ready to transfer into the center of a 325-degree oven for 15 minutes, or until they are not golden brown. All right, because with these cookies, we're choosing taste and texture over appearance. So these really are going to be quite light and barely blonde when they come out. But don't worry, they are cooked. And unlike the tops, the bottoms will be golden brown. And then what we'll do is very carefully transfer those onto a cooling rack and let them cool completely before we try to ice them. Otherwise, that hot jam will kind of melt the icing and it won't look as good. So I let those sit for about 20 minutes before I grabbed my pastry bag and a fine tip and piped over a very basic icing, which of course I will give you the recipe for. It's just powdered sugar and water. And I'm going to do 4 lines one way and 4 the other. And be careful not to move your piping tip too fast. Okay, watch the center of this one. Because I did that too quick and that line of icing was not thick enough, it kind of spread apart. And now I have a hole in the middle, which I might go back and fix later. I'm not sure, depends on my mood. But anyway, the point is go nice and slow and steady, so you have a nice even flow. And of course, like anything, the more you do, the better you'll get. And then once we have those iced, what we want to do is let them sit for about 15 or 20 minutes so that that icing sort of hardens up. So I let those sit for a little bit before plating them up, and I promptly went in for a taste. And people like to throw the term melt in your mouth around, but these truly were melt in your mouth. I mean, the texture is so tender and buttery. It's a miracle these things stay together. And of course, we have that beautiful, gooey, jammy center. So it is no mystery why this is such an iconic cookie, especially around the holidays. Okay, so that was version 1. Basically a shortbread cookie with a little bit of jam. Now let me show you version 2, which is much more jam forward. And these get prepped and panned up exactly the same way, except instead of pressing down with a wooden spoon or dowel, we're going to use an actual human thumb, which as you can see is going to give us a significantly larger and more shallow depression, into which we're going to be able to spoon like twice as much jam. And this time I'm going with strawberry. And in case it matters to you, the redder berries like strawberry, raspberry, etc. do probably make for a better looking cookie, or at least more colorful. And that's it. Once those are filled, we'll give them the old tappa, just like the first batch. And we will again pop those into the center of a 325 oven for 15 minutes. Or until again they're not quite golden brown. And then the only difference post-baking with these, because they are pressed out a little thinner and have more jam, they are much more fragile when they're warm. So we should probably let those sit on the pan for at least 5 minutes so they firm up a little bit before we try to transfer them onto a cooling rack. And since we did the fancy icing on the first batch, we'll just go ahead and use some powdered sugar on these. And what's going to happen after you dust that over is that the powdered sugar on the jam is going to dissolve and disappear, but the sugar that's on the cookie part is going to stay, which once plated up makes for a very simple but beautiful presentation. And of course, to be fair and consistent, I'll go ahead and taste one of these as well. But unfortunately, as I picked that one up, I dropped it on the table, and it broke, so I had to grab another one. But anyway, even though these were made with the same dough, using basically the same technique, this style does give you a different experience. Alright, it's definitely jammier, but because it's also thinner, these seemed even more tender and melt in your mouth. Oh, and by the way, one tip for you kids watching. Don't be putting your cookie back on the serving platter after every bite. Okay, that's not good table manners. You're only allowed to do that kind of stuff if you're filming a recipe video. But anyway, that's it. How to make thumbprint cookies. 2 slightly different styles. And which one did I like better? It was a tie. They were both perfect in their own way. And for variety's sake, you should probably do some of each. But whether you do both or just one or the other, I really do hope you give these a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Chocolate Snowcap Cookies. That's right, what's better than a chocolate cookie? One that looks like it's topped with delicious snow. And this is definitely one instance where crack is not whack. In fact, it's critical to the look of these classic holiday cookies. So let me show you how to make these, and as usual, I'm going to say they're pretty easy. So for step 1, we're going to get our dry ingredients together, which means in a bowl I'm going to dump some all-purpose flour, along with some very high-quality cocoa. Check the blog, I'll tell you which one I used. We're also going to need some salt and some baking powder. What's that? You mistakenly used baking soda? That's why it didn't work. So make sure you're using baking powder. And we're going to take a whisk and we're going to mix that up thoroughly. And we're just going to set that aside until needed. All right, so that's done. Next up, we're going to melt some chocolate over some hot water. Just put that on low, put that bowl on top, and just let it sit there until it melts completely. And of course, if you put a little too much chocolate in, you must adjust. There, that's perfect now. Okay, so we're going to let that chocolate sit over hot water until it's melted. And at that point, we can start our batter. So in the stand mixer, I have some room temperature butter. We're going to add some brown sugar. And as you can see, we have our paddle attachment. And we're going to go ahead and what's called cream the butter and the sugar together, which simply means mix it together for a couple minutes until it looks like a paste like this. And then we're going to add 2 whole eggs, but one at a time. All right, so crack one in, turn the mixer on. As soon as that one's incorporated, then you can add the second egg. Okay, because eggs are almost all water and the mixture in there is almost all fat, those don't like to mix. So if you add both eggs together, it could separate. So one at a time. And once that second egg is mixed in completely, we're going to go ahead and grab our bowl of melted chocolate. And assuming you haven't just simply chugged it, we're going to pour that into the mixer. We'll give that a quick mix. And then as soon as that melted chocolate is incorporated, we'll stop and add the dry ingredients. But before we do, give the sides a scrape and the paddle. All right, you want to clean it off so everything mixes in nicely. And then go ahead and pour your dry mixture in. You'll want to start on a slow speed so you're not wearing the stuff. And we're just going to give that a brief mix until basically those dry ingredients kind of disappear, or almost. And then we'll just scrape that mixture into a bowl, because before we work with this, we have to chill it thoroughly. So go ahead and wrap that in plastic, and then throw it in the fridge for about an hour or until it's firm enough to scoop, which this is. Oh yeah, that's scoopable. And sure, you can use a plain old spoon if you want, but you know I love my little sorbet scoop, so I can get perfectly sized cookies every time. And as we scoop these, we're going to drop them into a bowl of powdered sugar. So drop it in, roll it around, and once it's completely coated with sugar, pick it up and roll it in your palm to make a perfectly round ball. And once you've rolled it, we're going to go back into the sugar for another coating. The key to this recipe, as you will see, is a ton of powdered sugar on the outside. Oh, and by the way, not to spoil the ending, but you see how I shake off the excess here a little bit? That was a mistake. But as usual, my mistakes will benefit you. And you'll see what happens later. But anyway, you're going to coat your balls thoroughly in powdered sugar. We're going to place those on our cookie sheet. I line mine with a baking mat, but you could use parchment. And we're going to go ahead and bake those in the center of a 350-degree oven for about 12 minutes or until they look like chocolate Snowcap cookies. Check it out. Those look pretty good, or at least that's what I thought. But anyway, we'll get into that. So we're going to take those out. They're going to be very, very, very soft when they first come out, so let them sit on the cookie sheet for about 10 minutes to firm up a little bit before you try to transfer them onto your cooling rack. But after about 10 minutes, they should transfer easily. So I transferred those onto my rack, and as I waited for them to cool, I realized they're not as snowy as I wanted. I don't want dingy March snow. I want brilliant white January snow. So as these sat, that beautiful white snow kind of faded a little bit, which made me a little sad until I tasted them. And they were so unbelievably delicious, chocolatey, fudgy, and just absolutely beautifully textured. I kind of forgot about the appearance and simply enjoyed its chocolatey, fudgy goodness. But as soon as I finished, I knew I needed to do one more test. So I did two things. I let the dough chill overnight. I scooped out another small test batch. But except this time, I did not knock off any of that excess powdered sugar. I really piled it on. How much? Remember that scene in Scarface? That's how much. And then I cooked this batch exactly the same, 350 for about 12 minutes. And I noticed two things. The dough that sat overnight sat up higher. It didn't spread out as much. And because I coated them in even more powdered sugar, they actually came out way whiter, as you can see. So the moral of the story here is if you want chocolate Snowcap cookies that actually look like snow caps, you have to go Tony Montana on these. And make sure they have a super thick layer of that powdered sugar before you bake them. You almost literally can't put too much on there, okay? But anyway, wintry appearances aside, these really were great chocolate cookies. And I'm sure would be a huge hit at any holiday cookie exchange. So I really do hope you give these a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Russian tea cakes. That's right, these delicious cookies are neither Russian nor cakes. But if it makes you feel any better, they are great with tea. And besides that, because of their snowy appearance, they're perfect for the holidays, as well as being incredibly easy to make. So fair warning, if you are a fan of complicated procedures, you are not going to be a fan of this incredibly simple method. But anyway, let's go ahead and get started by getting our ingredients together. So in a bowl, I have a couple sticks of room temperature unsalted butter, to which we're going to add a packed third of a cup of powdered sugar. And right here you can see I definitely packed it, since I had a little trouble getting it out of the measuring cup. There we go. So we'll do some powdered sugar, also known as confectioner's sugar, followed by a cup of finely chopped walnuts. And most recipes don't say to toast the nuts first, but I do like to warm those up in a dry pan over medium heat. I think it makes those walnuts taste a little nuttier. But this is optional and up to you. You are the czar of how nutty your nuts are. But I do like to give mine a little toasting first, after which we'll let those cool before chopping them up. So I'm going to go ahead and add 1 cup of finely chopped, lightly toasted walnuts. And then we'll also need a pinch of salt, as well as a spoon of vanilla extract. And it doesn't matter which one, Mexican, Tahitian, Madagascarian. As long as it's real, I'm cool with it. And then last but not least, we will add our all-purpose flour and get to mixing. And the technique we're going to use, if you can even call it a technique, is what I call the old dump and clump, which means we just dump everything into a bowl and mix it with our hand until it's just combined and starts to clump up. And I realize this goes against every acceptable, proper cookie making technique, but I can't even pretend to care because this works perfectly well. So all I want you to do is use 1 and or 2 hands until it's just combined and it starts to clump together, which means we could roll it into balls. And one great tip I'd like to pass along here, if you're not quite sure this dough is mixed enough, it's not. Okay, you'll know. So if you see flour or chunks of butter, just keep going until it looks something like this, which as I just mentioned is to the point where it kind of clumps together and we're able to roll some balls. And at this point we could stop and refrigerate this and roll them later, or we could just do it right now, which is what I'm going to do. And to assist me with that, as usual, I'm going to grab my trusty sorbet scoop, which theoretically is going to ensure each of these cookies is exactly the same size. And once we scoop our dough, what we want to do before we place it on our baking sheet is roll it into a nice smooth ball. So I'm going to go ahead and do 1 baking sheet full, which as you can see has been lined with a silicone baking mat. And by the way, these uniformly sized balls is just not for appearance. Much more importantly, it's so they all cook at the same rate. And speaking of cooking, this isn't a dough that really spreads out a lot, but it does a little bit. So make sure these are evenly spaced a couple inches apart. Then once our pan is prepped, we are ready to bake. So at this point, we can transfer those into the center of a 350-degree oven for between 15 and 25 minutes, or until they're lightly golden. And I know that's a big range of time, but I'll explain why on the blog post. But long story short, I feel that people generally undercook these. Okay, so as I said, I want to cook mine until they're lightly golden. And if we peek underneath, the bottom should look like this. Okay, a nice light golden brown. And like I said, I will review all the cooking time variables on the blog post. But assuming we've cooked ours long enough, here's what we're going to do. We're going to let these sit for exactly 5 minutes, at which point we're going to toss these in powdered sugar. And we're actually going to do this twice. So this first time, since the cookies are still warm, that powdered sugar is going to kind of melt into the surface and form what's almost kind of a thin frosting. So they're not going to look super great at this point, but that's fine. Because what we're going to do after we give them this initial coating is let them cool completely and then toss them again. And it's this second application of powdered sugar which really gives them their signature look. And by the way, some people just like to dust the tops so that you can see a little bit of that cookie coming through. But I do prefer to coat them as much as possible. I mean, for me, when it comes to Russian tea cakes, if they're not white, they ain't right. So I'm going to go ahead and finish off that second coating. And then once our tea cakes have been sugared a second time, they are finally ready to serve. With, yes, one more final dusting of sugar to garnish. And no, this video is not sponsored by the powdered sugar industry. It should be, but it's not. But anyway, I'm going to finish up with a little bit of hot tea. Well, actually, room temperature prop tea, but still. And our Russian tea cakes are ready to enjoy. And while the taste is amazing, buttery, nutty, and just sweet enough, what really makes these so great is the texture. I mean, they feel firm, but when you bite into them, they basically just disintegrate under tooth into something that I like to describe as very pleasantly sandy, which might sound a little weird. But you try these and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, okay? But anyway, that's it. Russian tea cakes. Nobody really knows how they got that name. Although since I do watch a lot of late night movies, I will take a guess and say it had something to do with a Russian mobster. But anyway, mysterious names aside, these are very delicious, super easy to make, and because of their appearance, are perfect for all these upcoming holiday parties. So I really do hope you give these a try soon. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Let's get ready to rumble. Sorry, I really wanted to hire that guy to do that for me, but he wanted like $1 million. But anyway, that's right, we're doing Rum Balls, a classic holiday cookie, even though they're more like a candy, but delicious any time of the year and incredibly easy to make. Okay, so there's a million versions of this, but this is my favorite, and it uses leftover brownies. That's right, I have 3 stale brownies. They can be old and dry, it doesn't matter. In fact, it's even better. And yes, of course I'm going to give you the recipe for the brownies, although this works great with just regular cheap store-bought chocolate brownies. I'm going to crumble those up in a bowl, and I'm going to soak those with dark rum, and a lot of it. By the way, this is not a cookie for the kids because it does have real, unburned off rum inside. So you will catch a little buzz off these, which is, all part of the show. So you're going to pour the rum over, you're going to mix it very well. It's going to take a minute to soak in, but it will. And if you keep stirring, you're going to have this lovely chocolate rum paste that looks something like that. Okay? So I'm going to line a plate with plastic. You can also use a silicone mat if you want. I'm going to use this little sorbet scoop to make these little 1-inch balls. You really can make these any shape or size you want. All right, but I prefer smaller. I'm going to scoop those out, and they're way too sticky to work with. So what we're going to do is we're going to cover those. We're going to pop them in the freezer for about 15-20 minutes until they're firm enough to roll. And how will you know? They'll be firm enough to roll. That is your main clue. So I'm going to just roll them between my palms. It only takes a few seconds. By the way, this batch I'm showing you makes 20 small, 1-inch rum balls. All right, once I've rolled them all, I'm going to throw those back in the freezer to firm up again while I make my chocolate coating. Not to be confused with chocolate codeine, which I believe is illegal. All right, for the chocolate coating, we're going to chop up a very good quality dark chocolate. I'm going to give you all that specific info on the blog. All right, once that's chopped up nice and small, just like that, I'm going to throw most of it in a bowl. All right, but I'm going to reserve about 25% of it for later. You're going to see what happens. I'm going to put about 1 inch of water in a saucepan, bring that to a simmer, place my bowl over the hot water. All right, you don't want the bowl touching the water. All right, we're just using the steam here. My heat is on the lowest setting I have. And when that chocolate gets about halfway melted, I'm going to turn off the heat. I'm going to lift the bowl up to release a little bit of that steam. And there's going to be enough heat left in that water to melt the chocolate the rest of the way. All right, you want to be really careful not to get any water drips in this chocolate. It will ruin it. All right, it will seize up, as they call it, and you'll have a mess. All right, as soon as that chocolate melts, and again, remember the heat is off, I'm going to add in that 25% of chocolate I didn't add at the beginning. Stir that in. That's going to lower the temperature a little bit. It's going to make for a very, very easy to work with chocolate coating. Okay, so as soon as that second addition of chocolate has melted in, we are ready to basically start coating our rum balls. All right, so we're going to take those out of the freezer. We're going to toss it in. We're going to use a couple forks to kind of roll it around, make sure it's coated completely. And then we're going to carefully lift that out and place it on either a plastic lined pan or one of these silicone mats. Now, here's how you don't want to do it. Have a bunch of extra chocolate on the fork and make a big mess. Okay, here's another one done correctly. Roll it around, cover it completely, lift it out of the chocolate, and let the chocolate drain a little bit. All right, you get those last couple drops off there. Then, when you push it off onto the silicone, it will just have a little bit underneath that makes a nice little base like that. All right, so that's a good one. That's a good one. So these that have the little feet, not so great. But don't worry. You can just cut those a little bit like that. When you lift them off, nobody will know the difference. Okay? So basically, when the chocolate hardens, which is just going to take a few minutes, you're ready to serve. I'm going to throw those on a plate. I'm going to dust with a little cocoa powder just to make them look oh so cool. You can refrigerate those until needed. And there you go. What a gorgeous, gorgeous holiday cookie, special occasion confection. So have you ever been sitting around thinking, I can't decide whether I want to eat chocolate or do shots of rum? This combines the best of both in one delicious bite. All right, let me bite into one of these. Just incredible. All right, that firm, crisp chocolate coating, that soft, succulent, almost like a chocolate rum ganache inside. Just a beautiful thing. So anyway, whether it's for a fancy holiday party or just any time of the year, I hope you give these a try. All the ingredient amounts are on foodwishes.com, as usual. And as always, enjoy. Gingerbread Whoopie Pies. That's right, we're doing a gingery holiday take on this very old American classic. And as legend has it, when this was invented, the first people that tasted it were so taken with its deliciousness that they ran around yelling, "Whoopie, whoopie!" Of course, they were burned as witches, but happily the name caught on and survives to this day. So let me show you how to make these. For step one, we're going to get our dry ingredients together, which is white all-purpose flour, some baking soda, please don't use powder, some salt, lots of ginger, some cinnamon, some white sugar, and some dark and mysterious molasses. And by the way, that's not the brand. Those are just adjectives. We're also going to add some vegetable oil and one large egg. All right, we're going to mix that together, and it's going to be very stiff. And for some reason, I started using a whisk, which really wasn't the best tool. So I'm switching to a spatula, and I'm going to mash that all together until it looks like that. And at that point, we're going to pour over some boiling water. And that's going to soften this up significantly. It's going to turn that kind of dry, stiff dough into a smooth, soft batter. And that's really what we're looking for. Technically, we're actually making little tiny cakes, not cookies. So while this is a pie, it's actually a cookie made from 2 cakes. Is everyone clear on that? And for some reason, I still have the spatula in my hand, so let me switch to the whisk to make sure we have no lumps. And by the way, why do people get so amused when I switch utensils? You got to admit, it's a little odd. All right, so once that's mixed completely smooth, we are ready to pan these up. So I'm going to use a silicone matte-lined baking sheet, and I'm using my 1 ounce, I believe it is, sorbet scoop. All right, you can, of course, just use rounded tablespoons. I'm just going to bake 12, which is going to make 6 finished whoopie pies. All right, if you need some help with a spoon to make these perfectly round, go ahead. And because this batter is kind of thin, do not, under any circumstances, give them the old tappa-tappa. Just put them straight into a preheated 350-degree oven for about 12 minutes, or until they look like this, okay? Now, what you're going to want to do is let these cool on the pan for about 15 minutes until you can handle them without them breaking, and then I like to transfer them onto a rack to finish cooling all the way. You cannot stuff your whoopie pies while they're warm, all right? So while those are cooling, I'm going to go ahead and make my cream cheese filling.
So in a bowl, I have some room temperature cream cheese, a little splash of milk or cream, some vanilla extract, some powdered sugar, of course, and a little chunk of butter. And of course, anytime you're working with powdered sugar, you're going to want to start the mixer off very slowly. Otherwise, you'll be wearing this stuff, and you look like one of those kabuki dancers. But anyway, be careful. Start off slow, and then when it starts coming together, turn it to high, and whip that until it's very light and fluffy, something like that. And then you've probably figured out the next step. You're going to take one of your gingerbread cookies / little mini cakes. You're going to pipe and or spoon some of that cream cheese filling on. You're going to top it with the closest match. And that is a gingerbread whoopie pie. Very cool. Let's do that one more time just so I can get a gratuitous close-up. There we go. And once those are all filled, I'm going to go ahead and wrap these up and refrigerate them just so that filling tightens up. I think these are better cold. If you got the munchies like super bad, you can eat these as is, but they are better chilled. So I'm going to throw those in the fridge for at least a half hour. And by the way, if you're looking for a very excellent pairing, may I suggest beer? It goes with everything. And that's it. Once chilled, they are ready to enjoy. All right, let me try one of these. My God, those are so delicious. Just a great combination of that soft, spicy cookie / cake and that creamy cream cheese filling. Yes, they're pretty, but they taste even better. Anyway, it's the holiday season, and exchanging cookies is a very popular activity. And imagine setting these down on a table next to your friend's oatmeal raisin. Oh yeah, you just won at Holiday Cookies. So I really hope you give these a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, whoopee! And enjoy. Gingerbread Biscotti. That's right, I was going to film a gingerbread house, but those take many hours, and are really made more for looking at than eating. So I decided to do these gingerbread biscotti instead, which not only look great and taste amazing, but if we had enough of them, I think we could stack them up into some kind of house-like structure. All right, maybe like a log cabin. Oh, and by the way, one other advantage of these is that you cannot dunk a gingerbread house into a cup of coffee. So with that, let's go ahead and get started by mixing up our dry ingredients, which will include some white all-purpose flour, some baking powder, or as the French chefs say, baking powder. We're also going to need a pinch of salt, as well as a ton of ground ginger, and of course some cinnamon. And then we'll finish up with a little bit of freshly grated nutmeg, plus like 1.5 shakes of cayenne, that no one's really going to taste, but it will raise the spiciness of our ginger a little bit. And then what we'll do is take a whisk and give this a good mix until everything is thoroughly combined, which is pretty easy. But if you wanted to make it a little more challenging and exciting, you could, if you want, use a really small bowl like this. But anyway, we'll give that a mix and set it aside, and then move on to chopping our crystallized ginger. And a great tip here is to carefully rub your blade with a little bit of vegetable oil, which will help prevent that stuff from sticking to your knife. And by the way, crystallized ginger is one of America's great underrated candies. All right, just so wonderfully sweet and spicy. And we really do want to chop this up nice and fine, but not quite to a paste, because we do eventually need to incorporate this into our dough. And if this gets too pasty, that's going to be a lot harder. But we really do want to chop it at least this fine, and even though it's going to look like it's impossible to do, I'm going to show you how we get all these pieces to separate once we add them to our wet ingredients, which by the way is the next step. And for that, we're going to add 2/3 of a cup of brown sugar to some unsalted butter. And by the way, what does that remind you of? Mickey Mouse? Was it Mickey Mouse? Anyway, to that we will add a little bit of molasses. And fun fact, in case you didn't know, it's actually molasses that makes brown sugar brown. And then what we'll do at this point is take our spatula, and we'll cream this butter and sugar together. And first we'll start with sort of a chopping motion, and then we'll move to sort of a smearing motion, and then we'll move to any motions you want that will work these ingredients into a relatively smooth paste. And once that happens, we're going to switch to a whisk, and then we'll mix in 2 whole eggs, but only one at a time. Whoops, looks like our second egg doesn't want to wait. But anyway, like I just said, we'll go ahead and add 1.5 eggs now. And as usual, when you mix eggs into sugar and butter, it's going to look terrible at first, and like it's not going to work. But just keep whisking, and you'll see in just a minute or so it will smooth out. And once it does, and it's looking something like this, we can go ahead and add our second egg, or what's left of it, and we will whisk that in as well.
And then once that's been accomplished, we'll stop and add some real pure vanilla extract, as well as that extremely sticky mass of chopped crystallized ginger. But once that's in there, by mashing and mixing with our whisk, all those little pieces of ginger are going to separate and become coated with that butter and sugar mixture, which is going to prevent them from sticking to each other. And after a minute or so, those should be distributed pretty evenly throughout this mixture. And that's it. Once our declumpification is complete, we will switch back to a spatula and we'll mix in our dry ingredients in 2 additions. So we'll go ahead and dump in about half and mix that in. And then once that's all incorporated, we'll go ahead and add the rest. And the reason for that is mostly so the flour doesn't fly out of the bowl. Okay, if we just dumped it all in, we'd have to mix a lot slower and a lot more carefully. So this way we'll just go ahead and stir in half. And once that disappears, we'll go ahead and mix in the rest. And I should mention, this is one of those rare dough recipes where we do not have to worry about overmixing the flour. So feel free to work this as long as you want. And then what we'll do once we form this very wet, very sticky dough is transfer it onto a long piece of plastic wrap, which because of its extreme stickiness is not the easiest thing to do. And I find having a butter knife alongside is very helpful. And if you wanted, you could transfer this dough right directly onto the baking sheet, and then use a couple wet hands to shape it. But since I like to refrigerate this dough before I bake it, I do find this method preferable. And once we do get that transferred on and wrapped up, it's pretty easy to slide our hands over the plastic to help shape this into a nice uniform size, which I'll say is about 12 to 14 inches long by about 2.5 inches wide. And don't worry about trying to get it perfect here, since once we refrigerate this and it stiffens up a little bit, it's going to be very easy to fine tune if we have to. And that's it. Once that's been wrapped and shaped, we'll go ahead and transfer that into the fridge for at least 30 minutes. Okay, longer is fine. At which point we'll pull it out and unwrap it, and position it on a Silpat line baking sheet. And yes, we might lose a little bit of dough stuck to that plastic wrap, but that's nothing compared to how much we would lose on our fingers if we did this with our hands. Especially since once you started licking your fingers, you probably wouldn't be able to control yourself, and you'd end up eating like 20% of the dough. You know it's true. And then speaking of hands, if you did for whatever reason need to do some fine tuning with the shape, you can do that by wetting your fingers and then smoothing out those edges, or whatever needs to get smooth. And that's it. Once we're happy with that, it's ready to transfer into the center of a 350-degree oven for about 30 minutes, or until it looks like this. Which, yes, is very attractive, and it looks like it's done. But so we know for sure, a toothpick or skewer stuck in the center should come out clean. And mine did, which means it's ready to cover with a clean towel, and then let it cool on the pan for 20 minutes. And the reason for the towel is that's going to kind of trap in some of the moisture, and it's going to hopefully soften up that crust a little bit, which is going to make the cutting a lot easier. But to hedge our bets, once we uncover it, before we try to slice it, I like to brush a little bit of water all the way around the bottom edge, where it tends to be the crispiest, and by softening that area a little more, we won't have to worry about those edges crumbling as we cut. And that's it. Once that's been accomplished, we can transfer that onto a cutting board. And then we'll take a serrated knife, and then cutting at a little bit of an angle, we'll want to do slices somewhere between 1/2 and 3/4 inch thick. And yes, of course you get to snack on that little end piece you trim off. Although don't judge it yet, since we still have to bake this crisp. And besides getting these nice and even, make sure you're cutting perfectly straight up and down. And I realize you didn't tune in for a geometry lesson, but please note, the more you angle your knife, the longer your biscotti will be. So if you want longer ones, simply cut it at more of an angle. And if you want shorter ones, just cut it straight across. But either way, once cut, we'll go ahead and transfer those back to the baking sheet, at which point they're ready for the final baking, although at a slightly reduced temperature. Okay, this time we're going to place them into the center of a 325-degree oven for 20 minutes, at which point we'll pull them out and give them a flip. And then it's decision time, since we're going to transfer these back into the oven. But for how long is going to be up to you. Right, maybe it's 10 minutes, maybe it's 15. That all depends on how crunchy you want these. And by the way, you can lower the oven temperature down to like 200 or 250, which some people advise so these don't turn too dark. But danger is my middle name. So I'm going to go ahead and pop these back in at 325 for another 10 minutes or so, or until they were pretty much dry and crispy all the way through. And then once we think those have cooked long enough, we'll go ahead and transfer those onto a cooling rack, and then let them cool completely before we serve them and or decorate them. And please note, you will not know how crispy these are until they're room temperature. Okay, when these come out of the oven, the centers might seem like they're still retaining a little bit of moisture, but as these cool, they will crisp up, and they'll take on that signature crunchy biscotti texture. And that's it. Once these are fully cooled, we can go ahead and serve them as is. Or instead, as I highly suggest, pipe over some melted white chocolate. And once melted, all I did was transfer that into a sandwich bag and then snipped off the tip. And you know what? The first one's supposed to be the worst one, but not here. My second one was much worse. And what was making this challenging was the combination of a too small hole, plus I was squeezing too hard. So I took a breath and relaxed, and I lightened my grip, and they started to look a lot better. And by the way, that wasn't the easiest thing to do, since when things are going wrong, we tend to tense up and use more pressure. But that almost never helps. So something to keep in mind next time things are going wrong. Oh, and by the way, for tips on how to melt and temper white chocolate, you should check out the video we did for something called Nipples of Venus. And I guess I could have showed you how to do that here, but I didn't, because I wanted to say Nipples of Venus, which really are amazing, so check it out. And then what we have to do once these are piped is let them sit for about a half hour or more until that chocolate cools down and hardens up. But once it does, they are ready to enjoy. And that, my friends, is a truly amazing biscotti. Just such a delicious, deep, sweet, and spicy ginger flavor, plus amazing crunchy texture, which you're about to hear. Oh yeah. And while I think the white chocolate pairs best with this, you could certainly also do this with milk or dark chocolate. Or as I mentioned earlier, just serve them as is. Alright, that's up to you. I mean, you are after all the Truman Capote of your gingerbread biscotti. And speaking of breakfast at Tiffany's, how we are actually supposed to eat these is dipped into some steaming hot coffee. And what happens since these are totally dehydrated, they quickly soak that in. And then you take a bite. And as amazing as they were, they are now like 10 times better. And believe it or not, coffee and ginger are a surprisingly exceptional pairing. Right, the bitterness of the coffee really elevates that spicy sweetness of the ginger. So even if you don't drink coffee, you're going to want to brew some up for these. But anyway, that's it. My take on gingerbread biscotti. Whether you're going to make these for yourself, or you're going to make up a batch to give out as one of the greatest edible holiday gifts ever, I really do hope you give them a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.